Hey, St. Joseph's. It's day 15 of the consecration, so we're almost halfway there. We're making progress. And today's topic is Joseph, head of the family. Now, I think a lot of uh, the aims of the author of this book, other than helping us grow closer to St. Joseph, is kind of like tackling various cultural, social issues in our society and world that conflict with Catholic values. And I feel like that comes out a lot of the times, and it does come out a little bit here in this chapter where he talks a little bit about like political correctness and maybe some of the church's teachings that ruffle some feathers. I don't really want to dive too much into that because I feel like the author can do that himself. The book can do that, and there's plenty of much smarter writers out there than me tackling those issues. But I did think of one thing that might be useful when thinking about the topic of Joseph, head of the family. And as he said, like sometimes this idea of, the dad or the husband being the head of the family might be a little controversial in today's world. And to be honest with you, I am not one to give marriage advice right now because I'm so new into marriage and fatherhood that I'm doing this consecration just so I can do a decent job and keep my head above water. So I don't want to try to even touch on that subject. Someone I do suggest who really handles that subject very beautifully is Saint John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, or on a commentary on Theology of the Body might be helpful. Anyway, something that I think is useful. The other day I was having and by the other day I mean a little bit back, I was having a conversation with some skeptics, right? These people weren't Christians and they were kind of skeptical of Christianity. They considered themselves atheists and agnostics. And they were bringing up a lot of very powerful personal points that, really caused me to go home and think. But they were really grappling with the idea that God could be all good and all powerful. Because they were thinking that these two things seem to really contradict each other, right? Like, how could somebody be all powerful, all just, kind of like completely in control, and yet all good, all forgiving, all these things. And, I didn't really know what to say to them at the time, but I do hear people bring this up, that the kind of attributes of God sometimes seem to be contradicting. But anyway, they were really kind of grappling with this, and I was going home and, praying and reading and watching various videos, and this idea came to me that I went back and I shared with these guys, and it really kind of seemed to make sense to them. And what I said was, it's interesting that you say that you struggle with the fact that God is all powerful and all good. But isn't that exactly what we want our dads to be, our fathers to be? Isn't that like how we view our dads? Like, we want them to be all powerful in the idea of in control, strong, protective. Like, we don't have to be afraid because they've got it all under control. But also all good because despite having it all under control, despite being, kind of um, you know, like not like having no weaknesses in the eyes of a son, right? The father, despite being in control, having no weaknesses, we also want that kind of inner vulnerability, that inner relationship with our dad. We want them to be our buddy. We want them to care about us. We want them to not just be in control, but also love us. And, it's interesting how in our desires for our own dad, the kind of confliction over the conflict between all good and all powerful and God almost makes sense, right? Like, it stops being like, how do these two things work together, and be like, oh my gosh, that's what I want. More than anything in my dad, it makes sense that it would be in perfection in God. And I was, I was talking about that with these guys, and they really seemed it seemed to make sense to them. It seemed to like kind of, spark something in their minds and hopefully in their hearts. Um, but it's interesting because I almost think that this idea, right, which we use the idea of a dad to make sense of God, but I almost think that that idea of God could now make sense of like the idea of a husband or dad being head of the family, and what the heck that even means, and what the heck that even looks like, right? Because we live in a time where what does running a family look like? What does even like the idea of kings and things like that are, so far gone? Like, what does like power, like good power, even look like? And so I think in my head, looking at it in this almost kind of like reflective way might have help by looking at our dad to God, to, a husband and father might help, right? Because isn't that what we all want? Isn't that how we picture Joseph, right? As husband, like all completely in control, right? Like, he is working to protect and to guide Mary and Jesus to complete happiness, complete perfection, and and then yet also so tender, so caring. Not one thing that Joseph does is oriented toward anything other than the good and the happiness and the health of Mary and Jesus. And that's what, as you know, at least for me as a husband, I want, right? Like, I want to do everything in my power. I'm very bad at it, right? That's why I'm doing this consecration to St. Joseph. But I want to do everything in my power to strive to be like God, who is all good and all powerful. And I want to strive to do everything in my power, exert all my energy to protect my family, and yet also exert all my energy to love them and care for them and work towards their good. And we see that, we're celebrating Easter coming out of Good Friday, where we see that Jesus did all those things, right? And that's what St. Paul said. The reading for today quotes at length St. Paul, who talks about, husbands love Christ, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? And that's what we see Jesus did. The all good, all powerful God became man, suffered so much, all for the good of the church, his bride. And so I don't know how to kind of tackle right now, without doing much more extensive research and talking to a lot, smarter people than me, this whole idea of husbands as head of the family. But something I do think that we should think about whenever having discussions on the roles of leadership or the roles of family kind of positions is that idea of reflecting God, who is all good and all powerful, in trying to be, protective and yet completely caring. So I hope that made sense. It might have been scattered brain. It just came to me, even though it's a little disjointed from reading that conversation I had with those skeptics, and yet it seemed to be mean something to them, and it's been on my mind ever since. So I hope it makes sense to you. Please let me know in the messages or in comments. God bless.